This is episode 12, For Your Eyes Only.
So after disposing of a familiar-looking face, Bond is sent to recover a communication device known as the ATAC, which went down with the British spy ship as it sunk. The Russians are also after this device, though, so Bond must hurry. On the way, he meets Melina Havelock, whose parents were brutally murdered, and he also encounters Christatos and Colombo, each of them accusing the other of having links with the Russians. Bond teams up with Melina to try and solve who the true ally really is and find the ATAC before it's too late. Now, Jay, we recently rewatched this for the first time in many years. What did you remember before we rewatched?
If I'm being completely honest, Andy, I remembered nothing. And that means nothing at all. I couldn't even remember the Bond girl. I couldn't remember who the villain was, the henchman. I couldn't even remember the rough plot at all. The only thing I did, well, it's not even, I won't say I remember the film, but obviously we've got our Spotify playlist. That's the only thing I remember is the song. That, I don't remember anything in terms of the context of the film. It's a weird, because I've seen this film, I think we said, before we went live, we've watched these films numerous times, but I just can't remember anything on this one. It was a real stumbler when I was looking at, making my notes before I started watching the film, and I'm thinking, oh, I can't actually remember anything. And then, like I said, I was thinking like, well, who's the villain? And I was thinking, and I'm making sure I don't look up anything about the film before I watch the film, so I don't kind of get spoilers. So I'm kind of going into it fresh, even though it's been years and years since I watched it. I didn't want to kind of like do any research before I actually watched the film. And obviously we're watching the box set as well, so it's not like an individual DVD where you can see the front cover or the movie poster and you can see like who the villain is or who the Bond girl. So it's completely a blank slate for this one, Andy, which was, I quite enjoyed that because I didn't remember anything, so there's no kind of spoilers. What about you, Andy, on this one?
Weirdly enough, exactly the same. I couldn't remember a single thing. And again, like you, we've watched this multiple times. Nothing sprung to mind. What I tend to do as well as I'm watching is, if there are things that I remember as I watch them, I will then jot that down as I remembered this before the film started. So it's a little bit of a cheat there, but it's one of those things where I knew I remembered it, but maybe attributed it to the wrong Bond film or couldn't remember that it was in this film. In this case, before the film started, I wrote nothing down, and as the film progressed, I wrote nothing down because nothing was familiar. Very, very strange. But in some ways that enhanced my enjoyment of it, because I went in with no preconceived notions or expectations. So that's a positive, I think. Let's make a start with some of the information we collect for each film. So the main villains, we've discussed some of them earlier, but Aristotle Christatos is one of the villains. Emil Leopold Locke and Eric Kriegler are the three main villains. You'll hear a name, Gonzalez, throughout the podcast. We'll get onto that later. Arguably could be a villain, but in terms of the source of truth that we're using for the purpose of the podcast, he's not listed, so he doesn't count as one of the villains. But if any listeners out there think otherwise, feel free to hit us up on social media and we'll discuss it further. We also have three Bond girls, Melina Havelock, Bibi Dahl, and Countess Liesel von Schlaff. Easy for me to say.
The theme song is For Your Eyes Only by Sheena Easton, which is a very good song, just like to add there. Opening credits, we've got Roger Moore featuring again, Andy, in this opening credits, and he's featured, in the last one as well, from memory as well. And I think I pointed out before, I quite like that Roger Moore is appearing. We're seeing Bond in the opening credits, so I do like that. But also, we get to see Sheena Easton as well in the opening credits. And then we've got your usual components that are always present, which are silhouettes of the naked women. There's always a lot of water in the opening credits as well. And then this does feel quite a bit slower, I found, in terms of the opening credits as well. And I think that is probably keeping in sync with the theme song that they've got. The next one that we're keeping track of is the body count. So James Bond kills only. There's 18 kills, official James Bond kills in this one, which is quite a healthy number, I would say, in terms of Bond kills. So we can obviously go through where that sits in our rankings later on, but 18 is a good number for Bond.
Yeah, it certainly seems like he was a busy boy with his pistol in this film, in more ways than one. Let's talk about gadgets next. So there's not really many to discuss. A radio transmitter watch is really the only thing that we see from Bond. So a bit of a step back from previous films where he's had a whole collection of gadgets. This one's stripped back to basics. Bond, James Bond, the introduction we hear so many times. We hear it after 27 minutes and 18 seconds. So this is in keeping with previous Moore films, if memory serves correctly, where he tends to get the introduction in fairly late on in the film. It's not one of these where he introduces himself early doors. The 27 minutes and 18 seconds seems in keeping with previous films. No martini drinking in this particular film. That's another thing we're tracking, but obviously wasn't so thirsty in this one. And when it comes to hat wearing and hat throwing, we don't see Bond wearing the hat, but we do see a hat throw. Let's talk about favourite scenes next. Jay, what was your favourite scene?
Andy, I struggle with this one because watching the film, we obviously talking about a rating later on, but I struggle to think of something that really jumped out at me in terms of what my favourite scene was. So I was thinking again, after I watched it, I was thinking like, oh, which bit did I really enjoy? And the one that stood out for me was the car chase where it's just after Gonzalez is killed and Bond escapes from the hitman's mansion and he's escaping, and then you get to Melina's car, a little yellow car that we will mention later on, and then you've got a bit of a long car chase, haven't you, going down a windy road as well, and there's like various bits, with different cars chasing Bond and Melina. So I did enjoy it. That was probably my favorite one that really stood out. What about you, Andy, on this one?
So I like the car chase scene as well, but the one that just slightly edged it was the chase on skis that involved the motorbikes. Roger Moore loves a ski scene. He's been in a few now in the films we've seen, but this one stood out to me as being a little bit more, dare I say, realistic, but a little bit more gritty. Not the obvious kind of cheesy background things that we've seen in the past, and no obvious. There was clearly stuntmen involved, but no obvious use of stuntmen in place of Roger Moore. Just felt like a really good action-packed scene, so I plumped for that one as my favourite. Another important question is, how many times did you reach for your phone during the film?
I was very disciplined again, Andy. So I think I've done a few films now where I've not touched my phone at all. So it's 0 for this film, For Your Eyes Only. How about you?
I tried to be disciplined as well, but I did use my phone once, but it was to look up something about the film, and we'll speak about that later on. But otherwise I was engrossed. I was into it.
I think you can be forgiven for looking at your phone, Andy, to do a bit of research about Bond. Did you pause the film while you looked on your phone?
I did not. No, it was a quick search. Film carried on in the background, so hopefully I didn't miss too much in those few seconds.
No. But no, it was, like you said, it was engrossing, and I think there's only been a handful of times where we've looked at our phone more than once from memory so far in the 12 films that we've watched so far, and we're pretty much at the halfway stage as well, aren't we, in terms of the franchise?
Very close, yeah. Just goes to show kids that you don't always need your phone to have a good time.
In terms of ratings, Andy, I've given this one a 7 out of 10. I thought the film was very good. We're obviously going to go into our ratings, in terms of the rankings later on. So I won't really expand on the 7 at this point in time, but I think it's a respectable 7. What about you?
I too went with 7 out of 10. I think I was very clear in my disappointment of Moonraker in last week's episode. This felt like a return to form. So, very, very good film. 7 out of 10, very justified. But that's what we think. Nobody really cares what we think. The real question is, what did your wife think of the film?
So her comment, which is actually, just kind of similar to what you just said there about a bit of return to form. So she said this feels it's more like a spy movie after this sci-fi entry of Moonraker. She also commented about BB, saying, did she actually add anything to the movie? She's obviously, a young Bond girl. We talk about her age later on. And I have to agree, Andy, on that point. What does she actually add to the storyline? And also, she commented, and I know you've made this note as well in our show notes, that Roger Moore is looking old, and her comment was, it's a bit creepy with the age gap. Yeah, she really noticed about the age gap, and I know we've picked that up actually, haven't we, as well in our podcast notes. Also, she mentioned that there seems to be less love scenes in the movie and less nakedness. I don't know if that's going to impact on your nipple watch, Andy, in this episode, but she picked that out. And some of the things, that she mentions, I think, yeah, I've actually made that comment as well. And I think, she's been pretty much spot on there in terms of the four bits that I've said about, spy movie, Bibby doesn't add anything, Roger Moore looking old, the age gap being, a bit creepy, and also the love scenes. Out of those ones, I picked up on them all, except for I didn't really pick up on the love scenes. But thinking about it, there isn't much really, is there? We see the Countess, don't we? And obviously Melina, and then there's BB, which obviously doesn't get in a love scene, does it? So I think she's been spot on there, really.
I think that's a fair comment. I think the love scenes are somewhat of a staple of the franchise, but not necessarily needed to enjoy the film, I would say. There's enough to keep the nipple fans busy, as we will talk about throughout. So fear not. A few more facts before we get into some more detailed talking points. So the runtime of the film, 2 hours, 7 minutes, is again very similar to what we've seen for the past certainly 3 or 4 films in that kind of just over 2 hour mark, so very consistent. Released in 1981, so that's the first Bond from the 80s. And the franchise is very much established at this point, almost 20 years old by now. If you think that Doctor No was released in 62, we're now up to 81, so time is flying. And this features the directorial debut of John Glenn. Takes the helm for the first time.
Yeah, I think it's quite exciting that we're in the 80s, the year I was born as well, Andy, actually, 1981. I did feel it was an 80s film. I don't know if you felt that while you're watching it, in terms of a bit of the music. It just feels, I don't know, I would say kind of fresher as well. So it definitely feels like the 80s genre. I'm looking forward to these next few films during the 80s. So some general points now before we kind of go through the actual movie. And as always, Andy, I like to talk about the budget, the box office stats, kind of show me the money, as Joey Maguire would say. So the budget, $27.5 million. So that's the second largest budget after Moonraker. So in terms of the budgets, these last 2 films have really increased compared to the previous films in the franchise as well. So they seem to have a lot more money available for the Bond films now. In terms of box office stats, obviously we've started to track these in terms of the ranking table, so we're going to go a bit more in depth later on. But at the moment, just kind of give you a quick overview, is originally $195.3 million. So when we adjust that for inflation, we're talking $617 million, or round it up to 618, which at the time was the second largest box office return after Moonraker, which, Andy, if I'm being honest, I was surprised because in terms of the quality, I felt this film was better. And obviously, we've said last episode, and obviously I just mentioned earlier on in this episode, Moonraker was definitely a sci-fi feel to it. And yet this movie doesn't make as much as Moonraker. So I don't know if you have a view on that.
Yeah, my view is you can't always account for people's taste. I guess if you think of the budget, though, Moonraker was the largest budget, so therefore, if it makes the largest return, then you get what you pay for. But I think in this particular instance, in my opinion, the box office return doesn't match the quality of the film, I would say.
Yeah, I agree. And also, in terms of the films that are out at the same time as Moonraker or that was preceding Moonraker, like we said about Star Wars, Alien, the whole sci-fi genre, it seemed fresh in terms of audience. So that's why maybe people were coming along and watching it. Whereas this reverted back to a spy genre. You've already said, there was only one gadget as well. Maybe that was less anticipation, but like I said, they're still second largest, so you can't knock it in terms of box office returns. It's just obviously not number one at that point. So also, last point from me, before I pass over to you, Andy, is this was the last Bond film to be distributed solely by United Artists. So the studio merged with MGM shortly after the film's release.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jay. We mentioned John Glenn earlier, the director. So it's his first time in the big chair, but he had previously worked as an editor and second unit director in 3 other Bond films: On Her Majesty's Secret Service, The Spy Who Loved Me, and Moonraker. He goes on to direct a further 4 Bond films. So as things stand, as we are recording this in 2022, he is the director with the most Bond credits to his name with 5. Look out for anyone potentially breaking that record as future films are hopefully made.
So Andy, in terms of John Glenn directing 5 Bond credits, and you obviously just mentioning, will that ever be kind of surpassed? I can't see that ever happening, to be honest. You know how long films take now, and a director committing themselves to more than 5 films. I don't think that's ever going to be beaten.
Interesting.
I
tend to agree.
Because 5 films, you're talking a best part of a decade of films, really, aren't you? In terms of how long it takes. If you're saying 2 years, in terms of a year maybe to make it and then promote it, market it, you're talking about a good 2 years per film. That's a decade of someone's career. I just can't see that being broken, if I'm being honest.
Yeah, I tend to agree. And let's take as an example the first 5 films of the Bond franchise were. Let's take the release date. So 62 for the first one, 67 for the 5th one. So a 5-year gap. For the most recent 5, if my memory serves correctly, 06 for Casino Royale and 2021 for No Time to Die. So that's a 15-year gap for 5 films. So you're absolutely right. Unless the return to 1 per year comes back, then we're looking at some pretty long stints for one person to be in the chair. Unless they go back to previous directors, of course, to bolster their numbers.
Yes, which they have done, haven't they, in later films where they've gone back as well, which we can obviously talk about in future podcasts. And Andy, so before you move on as well, I had a thought, in terms of Moonraker having a sci-fi film, feel about it, kind of getting on the back of Star Wars, Alien, etc. I'm surprised we've not seen a superhero Bond film. Every film that comes out at the moment is a Marvel, a DC film, and Bond hasn't piggybacked on the old superheroes, has he?
No, this is true. Are you thinking a crossover, or are you thinking just superheroes in general? Or is it like Bond versus Hulk, for example?
Yeah, I don't know how it would work at all, if I'm being honest. It can't work because the Bond franchise is very much muted in terms of its it's in reality. I think the only fantasy element we've had is the live and let die, like solitaire in terms of reading cards, which is, supernatural maybe. Otherwise, it's always grounded in reality, I think, in terms of it, Bond can happen in like the present day kind of setting.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I wouldn't go as far as supernatural. I'd probably call it hocus pocus or bullshit. But I tell you what, Bond would probably really like a crossover with Wonder Woman. That would be his ideal crossover, Bond versus Wonder Woman. I can't say I would be opposed to that either myself. But should we get back on track before we turn this into a 5-hour Bond versus podcast? So there is a security door, and the tone of the keypad is the title song from The Spy Who Loved Me. Nobody Does It Better. So that's quite an interesting little tidbit. That there's a callback to a previous film. And we've mentioned this a couple of times now. For Your Eyes Only was an attempt to bring the franchise back to reality. Moonraker obviously was the sci-fi feel, Bond in space. So the idea was to bring this back to the early days, like the Doctor No era, so limited gadgets, as we talked about earlier as well.
Around the time of the film's release, Moore appeared in a comedy film, The Cannonball Run, which Andy might bring back memories to the quiz last week where I tried to trip you up about the Cannonball series. And he played a man called Sidney Goldfarb, who believed he was Roger Moore playing James Bond. So he spends the film in a Bond-like tuxedo, spoofing the 007 character. So this actually led to a clause that states James Bond actors under contract cannot feature in another movie wearing a tux, which I'm really surprised that they got away with doing that anyway. Then, where Roger Moore is playing a character who's pretending to be Roger Moore playing Bond, it just feels a bit funny. That does. I'm surprised it was allowed anyway.
Copyright, I would say, would have been a nightmare for something like that.
Definitely, considering the copyright issues that they've had, in the franchise so far.
Absolutely, that's them pushing their luck to the extreme. But a great film, The Cannonball Run, I must say.
Yeah, I've not seen that film since I was a kid, if I'm being honest. And moving on, some sad news really, in terms of some sad facts, is stuntman Polo Rigon was killed during the filming of the bobsleigh track portion of the ski chase. So during a sequence, Rigon's sledge overturned and he was trapped underneath of it. He later died due to his injuries he sustained. So that's obviously a sad fact that we found out during the research of this.
Yeah, and they say Hollywood is fake. And clearly that's not the case here. But yeah, sad news. So there's a scene where Melina and Bond are dragged across a coral reef for the sharks to eat. And that sequence originally appeared in the novel Live and Let Die. So a difference between novel and film in this case is a different novel than the film itself. So a bit of an interesting tidbit there. To obviously they've seen a part of the novel they enjoy, couldn't fit it into the film Live and Let Die, so they brought it in here. And another bit of sad news in some regards later on is that the actress who plays Countess Liesl von Schlaf, Cassandra Harris, was married to Pierce Brosnan, but sadly died at age 43 after they were together for 17 years. She died of ovarian cancer. I think it was about 10 years later or so. But a little glimpse into the future with a future Bond marrying a Bond girl, but died at quite a young age, has to be said.
Yeah, definitely. And Andy, going back to your point in terms of the novel, I know we've covered it before. So some of the films have changed the settings, haven't they? So I think when they change the settings of the film, certain bits in the book might not translate into the film. So I think it's quite good that you can reuse certain aspects from different books and put them in different films. So moving on, so the actress who plays BB, Lynn Holly Johnson, was a figure skater in real life. And obviously she does figure skating in For Your Eyes Only. And she was part of the Ice Capades, which is a traveling entertainment show featuring ice skating performances. I don't know if that's exclusive to America only. I don't know if we have anything like that in the UK, Andy. I don't know if you get out into any kind of figure skating or ice shows.
I have been to one. It was not Disney on Ice, which seems to be the big one that comes over here. It was a cheaper version of said thing. I can't remember what it was called. I won free tickets to it. But it involved ice skating and motorbikes and various stunts with fire and bikes and jumping off ramps onto the ice. It was pretty cool. Certainly worth the amount that I paid for the ticket, which was $0.
I've actually seen Disney on Ice actually with my wife and one of my kids. I don't think my other child was born then, so we've seen it. But no, I've not seen Ice Capades. So I thought that was interesting. But also, this was Johnson's third movie, and she's also featured in 11 movies in total and a number of TV episodes. So she hasn't had an extensive movie career. And also, this is the first of only 2 Bond films in which General Gogol is seen as an actual enemy. So we've obviously mentioned in the past, such as in the Spy Who Loved Me, where Bond obviously works with Amasova, but he does leave on good terms with Bond here. So even though the KGB are rushing to get the ATAC machine at the very end, where they kind of face off each other, obviously things could have turned sour, but they don't. So they leave on good terms, and that is possibly due to the interaction in The Spy Who Loved Me.
Yeah, that's a good point. I can't imagine there'll be any Russian intervention in future Bond films, not for the foreseeable future anyway. But also, let's talk about Christatos, played by Julian Glover. Now, Glover himself previously tried out for the role of Bond, obviously unsuccessful, but also appeared alongside some of the Bond actors. So Pierce Brosnan in 2 episodes of Remington Steele in 1985, and he also appeared in an episode of The Saint with Roger Moore. So he's got quite the link with both current and future Bonds as things stand. Some of his other credits include Star Wars, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, and also Game of Thrones. Let's talk about some goofs and continuity errors. So there's a scene where Bond throws the dead pilot out of the helicopter, and again, as we've seen in multiple films now, it's very obvious that it's a dummy rather than a body, because of the way the arms and the legs bend at impossible angles.
Yeah, and the only other one I really picked up on, Andy, so sometimes we do pick up on one. I know you're very good at picking up these kind of goofs or, continuity errors. So the other one I got was when Bond jumps off a wall with the umbrella at Gonzalez's place, you can see that it's not Roger Moore. You can see it's a stunt double. So I thought that was quite clear, which, I suppose you can't really forgive them. They don't want to injure their main the main guy, do they, doing a bit of a jump?
No, absolutely. Maybe some of this extra budget has gone on some more continuity editors, so that's why they're not as egregious as they are in previous films.
True. So we're starting now. So this is the opening scene before the music, and this is a bit of a running theme, Andy. In the last few podcasts, I kind of pulled out as a gun barrel, and I thought this was interesting. So in For Your Eyes Only, the white dot that you see does not slowly expand like it does in previous films. It just simply vanishes, and then from the center of the screen. So we're straight into the movie, which is the graveyard where we start.
Indeed, and the first thing we see is Tracy's grave. Tracy Bond, of course, the previous wife of James Bond, and it's one of the few times that Bond's wife's actually mentioned in the franchise at all. I noticed the gravestone itself said 1943 to 1969, we have all the time in the world, which I thought was a nice homage to On Her Majesty's Secret Service, which is of course released in 1969, has the theme song We Have All the Time in the World from Louis Armstrong, and is where Bond marries and unfortunately his wife is killed. Now the whole point of this was initially scripted to aid the introduction of a new actor to play James Bond. So Roger Moore, obviously, who's been in the previous 4, was seemingly reluctant to return, and Timothy Dalton is often cited as the planned replacement. And there are certain aspects of this film which kind of make that feasible in terms of the darker moments and the more down-to-earth feel, which is believed to be more suited to Dalton's portrayal than to Moore's. Obviously, Moore chose to stick around for whatever reason, and that was not, there's no need to introduce Dalton at this time, but that's an interesting point, that there is a different kind of look and feel about the film, and a scene like that would be perfect to introduce a new actor to the role, because it becomes very clear that it is Bond at his wife's grave.
Yeah, and I think I like this opening because we've mentioned it on previous podcasts. There's only been a few instances where Tracy is acknowledged in terms of the Moore films. So I did like that. So what we see now is a character who has a bald head and he is in a wheelchair. So he has the appearance of Blofeld, and I'm doing air quotes, but he's very ambiguous here. So he's not explicitly named. Although it's quite clear that this demise of him is quite important to the series. And this relates to the legal battle. And I think we've mentioned this in the previous podcast, but I don't think we've really gone in depth, Andy, in terms of it. We've kind of just like kind of hinted or just very touched on it. So, there was a legal battle dating back to the publication of James Bond novel Thunderball in 1961. So at the time, Kevin McClory claimed that Ian Fleming had adapted the novel from a screenplay for a proposed film adaptation of Bond character. And these two actually worked on this together. And it was actually Kevin McClory, that he, not Fleming, had came up with the Eye of Spectre. And therefore, the character of Blofeld was actually his creation and not Fleming's. So there was a legal dispute, and this actually left McClory with the rights of the Blofeld character. So that's why we don't see Blofeld, or he's not explicitly mentioned in the Moore films. So that's why it's very much left to, he's very ambiguous in For Your Eyes Only. So I think, when me and you watched Andy, we know that it's Blofeld, or it's supposed to be Blofeld. He's in a wheelchair. He's got a bald head, which, different actors have portrayed him with hair as well. But it's very much the version that Telly Savalas portrayed. And I think, and also the White Cat as well. So I think they're putting a number of hints that basically say it's Blofeld. There were no neon sign, no flashing arrows, so, to explicitly say this was Blofeld. But I think this was hinting at it was Blofeld. So it also finally tied up the plot hole, because he disappeared from the franchise. So he was in Diamonds Are Forever, and then that's it. He's disappeared now from the James Bond franchise. So I think that was a little nod from the producers to say, we don't need Blofeld in the series. We can move on. And obviously, the Moore films have been successful. We've already mentioned, Moonraker, For Your Eyes Only, the first, 1 and 2 in terms of biggest box office returns. So, there's no been demise of the Bond series. So I think that was a bit of a nod or a little dig at McClory.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jen. It's a good summation of the very complex legal battle that was going on at the time. We'll talk a little bit more about this unnamed bald man in a wheelchair with a white cat who may or may not be Blofeld. But just continuing with the scene, so at the graveyard, a helicopter arrives to pick up Bond, and we see a vicar doing the cross sign for Bond. Made me wonder whether the vicar knew something that Bond didn't, and whether it was a real vicar or not, I suppose. And the helicopter pilot gets killed by said bald man, who shall not be named, via some sort of electrocution, and then he proceeds to take control of the helicopter via some sort of remote control. But he's also got a speaker system within the helicopter, and he's taunting Bond as he's flying him around. I think it was around the Thames, wasn't it? There was a disused factory building near the Thames that he was flying him around in various dangerous manners.
Yeah, and what you just said about he who kind of shall not be named kind of just reminded me of Voldemort from the Harry Potter series there, Andy. So there's no linkage there at all, just a point. So the wife made a comment here about Blofeld looking like Professor X, which I was actually very surprised because she hates superhero films, she hates comic books, and she got the name correct. So I gave her a pat on the back. There, a virtual one. I didn't really give her a pat on the back, but no, I thought that was quite witty. And Andy, I've got a question for you, Andy. So I'm going to pose you a question. So before I kind of give you my opinion, let me see what you think. So do you think this is a disappointing end for such an important villain from the early films of the Bond franchise in terms of Spectre, Blofeld, where he was in, even though you might have not seen him in every film or you saw body parts of him, he was the main villain against Connery's version of Bond. So do you feel this was a bit of a disappointing end in terms of where we are at the franchise at movie 12?
So disappointing is probably the wrong word. I would say unnecessary. And the reason I say that is, whilst Blofeld is a staple of early Bond films and is clearly arguably the most important villain of the entire franchise, him appearing or seemingly appearing in this film out of nowhere after being missing for so long felt like it added nothing to the story, and it was just a scene put in there for some reason, and it just seemed out of kilter. I think in terms of the way he was disposed, it was not a bad scene. It was a pretty interesting and cool way for a character to meet their demise, but it shouldn't have happened here, and it shouldn't have happened in this film. I think I would have rather it just didn't happen at all because it was not needed. That's my view.
I agree. I think it was unnecessary. And, like we said, the more version of Bond, there's been no Spectre, no mention of Blofeld really. So it just seemed out of place in terms of coming back especially in terms of the opening title sequence, in terms of the opening, even before the title sequence. And it has no relation to the rest of the storyline, does it? No plot. It just seems like a message to the Kevin McClory in terms of who's got the copyright, and it just doesn't fit for me.
You can remove that scene, you still got a very, very good film.
Yeah, definitely.
The last thing to mention, we covered this earlier, it's obviously a dummy when Blofeld was scooped up by the helicopter that Bond regained control over. It was a nice opening scene, but yeah, it wasn't really needed. So then we move on to the opening title sequence and music, For Your Eyes Only, written by Bill Conti and Michael Leeson and sung by Sheena Easton. Interestingly, no John Barry this time around, and that was because he was unable to work in the UK for tax reasons.
Yeah, and Sheena Easton was the first title song singer to appear on screen in a Bond film, and she features in the opening credits. So I thought that was a nice little feature. Also, Bill Conti is known for his film scores. So he's done Rocky plus the 4 sequels, The Karate Kid plus the sequels, Dynasty, and The Right Stuff. So he's got a good CV, and Conti has been nominated for 3 Academy Awards, winning 1 in the Best Original Score category for The Right Stuff. He also received nominations in the Best Original Song category for Gonna Fly Now from Rocky, and for the title song of For Your Eyes Only. So, it's top draw there. That is a good replacement for the John Barry, who's obviously featured. Well, he's obviously been involved in the majority of Bond films so far. And also, I think this is like a recurring thing, Andy. So the producers of the film hired Debbie Harry to sing Conti and Leeson's song, but she quit when the producers refused to allow her band, Blondie, to write and perform an original song for the film. So Blondie's rejected song, titled For Your Eyes Only, can be found on their 1982 album, The Hunter. And you can listen to that on Blondie. You can listen to Blondie's version on YouTube, which I have done. And I think they definitely made the right decision to have Sheena Easton. I think Sheena Easton's version is a classic in terms of Bond songs. But there's been a few times now, isn't there, where another artist has either been linked or have done a version of a Bond song that we've managed to track down on YouTube.
Yeah, indeed. And I put the credit to you there for finding this information out, but it's one of those things that seems to have happened throughout the years as well. It's not limited to a particular era of Bond. I mean, even as recently as maybe the last film or the 24th in the series, wasn't there a version of a song written by Tom York of Radiohead that was rejected? And I know he took that news quite badly. Maybe that's something we'll discuss in a future podcast. But it's a recurring theme where people want to get on the Bond bandwagon with their theme songs, but there can only be one.
Like Highlander.
Indeed. So we're at sea next. We see a fishing trawler, which is actually an undercover spy ship. There's a hidden control room. And the ship is attacked. And one of the crew says, "What the devil is happening here?" It's very, very British. I hope you liked my attempt at a British accent, which is not bad for a British man to attempt a British accent and get it so wrong. But there you go. We see a plane boat. What are they called? Where the plane lands on the water. I don't actually know. Listeners, could you tell us what they're called? Because I keep calling it either a boat plane or a plane boat, and I don't know what it is. But whatever it is, it lands on the water next to the Havelock's yacht. Melina gets off. She boards the yacht and greeted her parents. I think she's got some gifts for them. Pilot of the plane boat flies away, but then turns back round and starts shooting and kills the parents. And there's a definite look of vengeance in the eyes of Melina as she's mourning the murder of her parents right before her face.
Yeah, Andy, I don't know if you've got a view on this. I felt that was a bit unnecessary. So the pilot basically, I don't know, I'm just being lazy. I'm just thinking of efficiency. So Gonzalez, we don't know it's Gonzalez yet, but Gonzalez, the pilot, is flying. He has Melina in the plane. He then lands, drops her off, then goes back up into the sky to turn around to then shoot, which, you're shooting from a plane, so there's potential to miss. They might have jumped overboard, go in a cabin, etc., etc. So why didn't he, if he was adamant about landing, then do the assassination on foot? Or why does he even bother picking Melina up? Or why doesn't he kill Melina in the plane and then do the flyby? I don't know.
Yeah. Interesting. I think there are a number of ways they could have done this. I like your idea of him landing and getting off the plane and doing it hand-to-hand combat. Maybe, he gets off like, "Can I borrow your shitter?" or something. Sorry, I know we can't really swear like that on the podcast, but I just did. Yeah, maybe he gets off the boat plane and just says, "Can I borrow your toilet, please, sir?" And then, goes and gets his weapon out, not that, and then comes back and kills the parents that way. That could be an alternative method.
Yeah, it just, when I watched it, I just thought, that was a bit weird. It just seemed a bit inefficient, but maybe I'm just overthinking these things. So we're now in London/Moscow. So MI6 Chief of Staff Bill Tanner finds out that the spy vessel has been sunk, but also at the same time, General Gogol is told that the vessel carrying the ATAC, which is I think they struggled with the acronym here, because when, the ATAC stands for Automatic Targeting Attack Communicator, I think they probably thought of an acronym and then tried to think of words that fitted there. And I just think it's quite weak, that acronym, in terms of the actual words that fit that. That's just my view. And then the Russians find out that it's been sunk, and he sends someone to retrieve it.
Yeah, I think what they've done there is they've created an FFLA, a forced four-letter acronym. There we go. See what I did there? Let's move on. I can't get much lower than bad jokes like that. So we're at MI6. Moneypenny's looking in the mirror doing a lipstick, and in the mirror you see a hat thrown by Bond landing on the hat rack. It's a short scene, a little bit of flirting, probably not as much as usual. And again, I've noted, and it's not really right of me to say this, but they are both looking really old now. And this is a few films in a row, and newsflash, they're not going to get any younger in the next one. And its age is really starting to show, I would say.
I agree, because like you said, we've picked this out on a number of episodes now, and like you said, it's not going to get any better.
We'll see if the miracles of time have worked wonders for the next film, but I somehow doubt it. Moneypenny says that M is on leave, which is a way of covering for the fact that Bernard Lee, who played M for so many years, actually died before he could film his scenes. So out of respect, they didn't feature M in the film, and they didn't recast a new actor in his place. So they distribute what would have been his dialogue amongst Q, Bill Tanner, and Frederick Gray. And to date, this is the only Bond film in which there isn't an individual identified as M appearing.
Yeah, so again, another bit of sad news, isn't it? And that's 3 of them now that we've covered in this podcast.
We're really bringing the tone down. We need to liven it up a little bit, I think.
We are, and I don't know how to do that, because my next point is this is the only film that we see Bill Tanner, who is the MI6 Chief of Staff, played by James Villas, and it's his only appearance in the franchise. So Tanner and Sir Frederick Gray order Bond to find the ATAC, which, unsurprisingly, Bond knows a bit about already, so he's done his background reading. And then we leave MI6 and we're in Madrid now. So Bond is in Madrid and he's following up the lead of Hector Gonzalez, and he's obviously the pilot that we just mentioned who killed the Havelocks earlier on.
Indeed. So that's a return for Gonzalez. Also making a return is the Lotus Esprit. In this instance, it's the Lotus Esprit Turbo. The first Lotus Esprit was, of course, in The Spy Who Loved Me. But it was nice to see a classic car making its triumphant return. We see a lot of sexy ladies at the baddie's home. They're having a party around the pool. Various scantily clad ladies are doing what scantily clad ladies do at parties, just sit around looking good. Bond is sneaking around. He sees a henchman, and he's kind of hiding. And the henchman is on a balcony, spots the lady, and the henchman and the lady start kind of kissing and canoodling. And it's at this point we get nip slip number 1. So for you nipple fans out there, this is the point in time where you want to pause the film and have a good look. Also, if you are only listening to this to hear references of nipples, grow up. This is a mature podcast. We won't really accept that sort of thing. But if you are interested, this is the first nip slip of the film.
And spoiler alert, it's not the last, Andy, is it?
Oh, no.
So Bond gets caught, and we then see Hector, basically, he's on a diving board, and as he dives in, he gets shot by an arrow. So during Bond's escape, we see him use an umbrella to jump off the wall and down a drop.
I wrote a note here, or a question rather. Is this James Bond or Mary Poppins?
I bet he would love Mary Poppins' bag, which is just full of gadgets, wouldn't he? He could just take that on all his
Q must be
missions.
working on that somewhere. But let's bring this back around to our one earlier talking point. Bond crossovers, James Bond versus Mary Poppins. Now there's a film idea out there. I could take one of the lead roles, I think, in that, since it was my idea.
Mary Poppins.
Indeed. That could be a good Mary Poppins. You heard my attempt at a British accent earlier. Very, very Mary Poppins, I would say.
Better than Dick Van Dyke's.
I'm not going to argue that. That's for sure. Let's move on. So the music, we mentioned this, obviously the first film in the 80s for the Bond franchise, and the music is noticeably different to the usual score. Now, whether that's just a sign of the times or whether it's because we've not got John Barry on board, I don't know, but it is noticeably different, and I thought generally pretty good. So back to the Lotus, and one of the guards or henchmen is there, and he triggers the self-destruct system on the Lotus. There's a shot of a sticker on the window where it's labeled burglar protected, and then the car explodes. And I just wondered if this is Bond's kind of day-to-day car, and he's in a hurry one day and he just forgot about it, like, and then his car blows up because he's forgot his key, or he's left something about something ridiculous. His death is going to be front page news, isn't it? Not for the first time.
It would be, but can you imagine how many cars he goes through if he's parking in London or somewhere? It'd be very expensive for MI6, the amount of cars that are going to be blown up.
Or, if he leaves it somewhere and the parking attendant, well, not the parking attendant, what am I thinking? What if the traffic warden comes along and slaps a ticket on the windscreen? Gets blown to high heaven.
And I think that's the first time we see that, don't we? The sticker. I don't recall seeing it on any other films.
No, it's quite a cool feature, but it's one of those that you can only use once. It's not like a real selling point of a car. If you're wanting, oh, by the way, if someone touches it without you wanting them to, it blows up. It's not an easy sales strategy, that. But of course, that means his car's out of action, so Bond and Melina need to escape by other means. Melina has a car, but it's not quite what you would call a Bond car. She's got a yellow Citroen 2CV.
Yeah, so during this next car chase, which, Andy, this is the one I mentioned is my favourite scene from For Your Eyes Only. So we're in this car chase, we get a car flip, and then they flip the car back. We see a car get stuck in a tree, and then there's a little funny scene where one of the henchmen's cars kind of pulls up alongside Melina and Bond, and then more Bond kind of just like a little funny nod to the opposition. So I thought that was quite funny. And then we also get a Chinese proverb, which I wasn't familiar with. I'm not very cultured, Andy, as you know, but the wife knew this. So straight away, she's pulled out Professor X, and now she's demonstrating a knowledge of the Chinese proverbs. So it goes something like, before setting off on revenge, you dig for 2 graves. So I thought that was well done. Another virtual pat on the back for the missus there.
She's doing well this week, has to be said.
Yeah, which, Andy, I don't know, what your interpretation of that was. I don't want to get too deep, but I read that, when Bond said that, I thought of a couple of things. Does that mean basically, if you're going for revenge, dig 2 graves because there is danger that you're going to die along with the person that you get revenge on? Or does that mean because you're seeking to get revenge, that a piece of you is dying as well?
That's very deep, isn't it?
It's very deep.
Yeah, either of those could work. I was thinking more along the lines of the former, where seeking revenge is a dangerous game, sort of thing. Or maybe it's just a case of, well, if that's how you're going to retaliate, then you're both as bad as each other.
Yes. Yeah.
Karma is a what. We're back to London next. Tanner's not happy that Hector's dead, and Bond failed to get the information needed. And Tanner acts like a bit of a snooty bloke here. He's obviously got a bit of a power trip going on and really talks down to Bond. We move on to Q Branch, a whole bunch of gadgets being tested and viewed in the background, and the usual banter now between Bond and Q, where Q is almost exacerbated by the fact that Bond is such a liability or a child. So there's kind of that tension between the two of them that we've seen in a number of films now.
Yeah, and I wonder, is Q unhappy because he's got to basically fit out another Lotus now? And does the Lotus basically come out of Q's budget? Is he thinking, is MI6 going to squeeze my budget now even more because Bond is? I know it's not his fault his car's being broken into, but is that what some of the banter's about? He's not happy that James Bond. I think we said in the last episode, or I posed a question. We don't see many gadgets, if any gadgets, reused, and now he's got to fit out another Lotus, which can't be cheap.
Maybe there's another agent waiting for it. He's got a mission next week. He's been promised the Lotus, and now Q's got to explain that he can't have the Lotus anymore.
Yeah, and they've just got a little yellow car now, probably. Melina's one. So we do see a gadget now, which we didn't include in the gadget list because it's not one that Bond uses. So that's why we've not included it. So Q and Bond use the 3D identigraph to identify the bloke that Bond saw at Hector's place, which we obviously know is Locke. So my comment here, Andy, was I know it's 1981, but it's very old-fashioned, and I don't think this has aged very well. And then we also see Q does a banana nose for the man, and I think he's just doing that just to have, wind up Bond as well. But also, even though it's very old-fashioned, they managed to identify from quite a generic description of basically a white man with glasses, the actual henchman. So it does work. And I don't think that would work nowadays in terms of someone trying to describe a middle-aged white man with glasses and then try to go through their database. I don't think they would get any results or too many results.
I think the only results you would get would be the characters of Guess Who, or maybe the Lego Man or something. It's about as a generic a face as you could possibly wish for.
Yeah.
But maybe at that time in 1981, there was only one villain in the entire world with that hairstyle, that nose, and a pair of glasses.
Yes, and I'm just trying to think now if we had any villains with glasses on, which I can't think of.
Anyone out there in listener world with spectacles, we apologise for any offence caused with that statement. Not all spectacle-wearing gentlemen are villains, of course. Although I do seem to be looking at one right now on my Zoom screen.
I'd be very grateful I was just average looking.
You don't have that banana nose, though, as you said.
No, just in other parts. But anyway, so I also noticed as well, Andy, is how long were they in there? Because it looks like they've gone into the room, and then it looked like when they're nearing the end, or there's a bit where Sharon comes in with some drinks, but it just looks like it's deserted. And I think Q makes a comment. I haven't wrote it down here, but I think Q says something like, I don't know if I'm making this up now, but I'm sure he says something like, I'll turn off the lights or something generic like that.
Yeah.
So, but, you can get off, Sharon. Thanks for the drinks. But it's like in those films, I don't know if you ever noticed where they have a scene and it might be, I don't know, walking through some woods or walking through a building and it's daylight. And then like the very next minute is like nighttime. And this felt like that, where how long were they in there? Basically, everyone's gone in. And to be fair, it could be something like 5 to 5 on a Friday when they've gone in and everyone's just left straight away, clocked off. But I just noticed that.
Yeah, they've all gone for an after-work drink sesh and left Q and Bond to it. Or maybe Bond just wants some of that overtime, if he's getting time and a half. But that's more of Q's budget gone, isn't it, if he's paying him the overtime?
Yeah, definitely. So we leave London now and we go to Italy. So we're seeing a few different locations here. Not space this week, obviously. So we're in Italy now. And I made a comment here, Andy, but I'm struggling to remember this one. So the comment I made is, how much steam came from the hot taps? So I don't know what it's like at your house, Andy, and if we have, listeners from outside the UK, but in the UK, I have to run my hot tap for quite a while before I get any steam. I have to have my shower on hot, for a while before I get steam. Whereas here, it was like turn on the tap and it was just like misted up, steamed bathroom as well, is something I commented on.
Yeah, I think steam from a hot tap is quite unusual. Like, do you have your hot water turned up that high?
not with the gas prices at the moment. Blimey,
Indeed.
it's lukewarm. And I know you mentioned this, Andy, and I think we mentioned this in a previous episode. I'm sure we have, but this is another ski location for Moore. And, you know, the comment I made was Roger Moore loves the ski scene. And I'm sure we mentioned this in the previous episode, where you think of Bond actors and in terms of what they kind of link to. And when I think of Roger Moore, I just think of ski scenes. He loves it. He loves a bit of skiing.
Yeah, this is like a paid holiday for him, isn't it? You know, he's not bothered about playing Bond. He just wants a nice skiing holiday paid for on someone else's dollar.
And we mentioned in a previous episode that as part of his contract for Bond, he gets cigars, doesn't he, as well? So he loves going to the Alps or something with smoking his cigars.
Yeah, we're getting a real picture of Roger Moore as well as James Bond, I think, over the course of these movies. So one thing I mentioned right near the start was the introduction of Bond, James Bond. But at this point, he said it 3 times throughout the film. And it feels like it's the most times it's been said in a Bond movie so far, maybe ever. In fact, I'm struggling to recall whether it's even been repeated once in previous films. And now it's been repeated twice.
I tried to research this, Andy, because I thought the same of you as you, and I couldn't find anything. I was hoping to find how many times he says it per film, but I struggled. I think there is a film where it's mentioned twice, or he gets cut off, or someone says it as well. You know, is Bond, James Bond. But yeah, this is definitely, it feels a lot so far. A lot at this point, in terms of the film as well. If anyone else knows out there listening that, Bond has said it more than 3 times in a movie, let us know.
Yeah, maybe it's to do with his advanced age and he's just forgotten that he's already introduced himself. So he's just going around telling everyone that he's James Bond. But speaking of age, we meet Bibi at the ice rink in Cortina. Bond is there at a meeting with Christatos. Now, the actress playing Bibi is Lynn Holly Johnson, who was 22 at the time. But Bibi, the character, is 16 years old in the movie. Lynn Holly at 22 is the second youngest Bond girl. So the youngest Bond girl so far was Daniela Bianchi, who played Tatiana Romanova in From Russia with Love at 21. But Lynn Holly comes in at second youngest at 22.
So I thought there's a funny bit here where Bond shakes the hand of Christatos, and then Christatos basically gets up to leave. But you see Bond's friend Luigi, he basically offers a hand, Luigi does, and Christatos just leaves it hanging. So that did make me chuckle. But I'm a bit, juvenile, so immature. So it did make me chuckle, that did. But also, Bond is very bossy with Bibi as well. And Bibi takes an immediate fancy to Bond, which was quite weird because obviously she just got introduced to him. She's doing her ice skate training in the ice rink. And she comes over and she's just, she's not even wooed by Bond because Bond hasn't done any kind of put out any of his moves, has he? She's just taken straight away, and she says something like, Bond will look after me, or Bond will basically, I can't remember what the situation is, but she basically says Bond will look after her or will help her instead of Christatos, doesn't she? So I thought, straight away, but he's quite bossy with her as well.
Yeah, it's a weird dynamic. This is the point of the film where I got the phone out because, as we mentioned, Lynn Holly was only 22, Roger Moore 53, and I didn't know that at the time, so I needed to Google what the age difference was because it was kind of weirding me out a little bit. Now, I guess in Bond/Moore's defense, there wasn't the usual attempt of wooing and trying to bed her from Bond's side, and he was almost acting almost like a father figure or guardian type figure in terms of his attitude, whereas Bibi was the one not putting the moves on at this stage, but was blatantly obvious with her desire. And it's a very strange thing because I think it's this same scene where they're intimating that she's very innocent and almost vulnerable, whereas clearly that's not the case. But it's a bit of a strange dynamic, I thought, and the age difference kind of weirded me out a little bit. And another note is that there seems to be a lot of focus on Bibi's face during her scenes by the director Don Glenn. I don't know if that's a conscious effort to like desexualize her, or by not focusing on the body so much, but because of the age. But there was a lot of focus on her face in particular.
Yeah, when that was happening, it kind of just reminded me of like older films, people like Monroe, where they do that zooming in and there's like a glow on the actress's face. So that was kind of reminded me. But also, what I noticed was Roger Moore's eyes were really, really blue, quite piercing eyes, which reminds me of Daniel Craig as well, because he's got really piercing eyes, isn't he? I don't know if his eyes are blue though, from memory.
I think he is, yeah.
So anyway, carrying on, we're talking about close-ups and Moore's blue eyes. Will Bond find Bibi in a shower? So there's been a few instances where Bond has found a woman in his room, hotel room, shower, bathroom as well. But Bond seems to have developed some standards, and he resists Bibi's flirting as well. And I think I put that down to her age, probably. I think that's a step too far for Bond. And Bond asks Bibi to get dressed. And then I made a note here to say, the next moment, Bibi's hair is dry. And we've picked that up before, haven't we? Where in one scene, I'm thinking of Honey Rider on the beach. And I think that's happened before in another film as well, where an actress has wet hair and in a minute or in the next shot, it's dry.
Yeah, same with Bond as well. His hair rarely falls out of place. Just one thing to add at this point is, not only is Bibi flirting, I think she actually forces a kiss on him as well, and he has to push her away. So that kind of gives you the difference in dynamic, or the difference in approach between Bond and Bibi. Bibi clearly knows what she wants. Bond is resisting.
Yeah, which is obviously out of character for Bond. So Bibi, so what we get now is they go to the biathlon, which is the cross-country skiing and rifle contest. And Bibi points out her friend Eric Kriegler as well. And I thought this was a bit funny, because she's like, "Oh, he's my friend Eric." And then Eric kind of turns. I think she's like shouting, "Oh, Eric," and stuff. And I know he's obviously focusing on his biathlon, but he doesn't seem impressed, does he, to see her there at all?
No, I wonder if this is another one of those situations where she's putting in all the hard work and he's resisting. But yeah, he's clearly doesn't have the same feelings that she does. It's at this point where Bond is attacked by a group of henchmen. So later on in the scene, Eric and Locke being amongst them, and one of the henchmen is played by Charles Dance, classical actor, has been in a range of movies and TV shows, including quite recently he was in Game of Thrones, where he played Tywin Lannister. This is the second actor from the Game of Thrones series to appear in the movie, and Dance was also in the 1989 GoldenEye TV movie, where he played Ian Fleming. Now, it's during this kind of chase scene where Bond jumps over and in midair spins over the car whilst he's skiing, and then Eric tries to kind of go after him. But as he's trying to get up, he's falling all over the place. His balance is really poor. But we've just seen him minutes prior and completely in control of a biathlon. So why is he suddenly now no longer have the ability to use skis? So that seemed a little bit out of place.
I agree, especially where Bond managed to do a little twirl as well and still land it. And then Eric, who, like you said, is competing in the biathlon. And, you should be skilled in terms of skiing. But no, that's a good point, Andy, there.
Yeah, as the scene progresses, Bond tries to escape. And he goes on the ski jump, but ends up being pushed onto the other ski jump, which is a much bigger one, by the henchman played by Charles Dance. Now, I wondered at this stage whether Dance had accidentally saved his life, because at the bottom of the ski jump, you've got Eric and you've got other goons. They've got guns. They're taking aim at Bond, kind of waiting for him to come down off the ledge. And then Dan shoves him out of the way. He goes on to the different ski jump, which gives him a different trajectory. And Eric and the goons can no longer take aim. So I wonder whether that's just incompetence on the part of this particular henchman, or whether it's purely accidental that he maybe saved Bond's life there.
Yeah, I didn't pick that one up, Andy. That's a good find there. And I don't know the answer. Maybe it is incompetence. So also there's a little funny sound effect where Bond goes through some bunting as well. And then that's followed by a scene where there's a line of skiers that all fall over as well. So I thought that was a little funny thing in terms of, because we obviously said this film feels more serious. There's little snippets here and there, isn't there, of lightheartedness still. So I thought that was funny. And also, talking about little funny scenes, we see a waiter basically, it's when Moore kind of goes across the, like a little like a little jump, and there's like a little restaurant bar, and a waiter basically throws a tray of food over a customer who sat down as well, which I made a comment there to say that seemed to be a bit over the top. So I don't know, the waiter were just doing that to a rude customer, just using that as a bit of an excuse. But also we get a little bobsleigh scene as well, and a chase, which obviously we said earlier is where one of the stuntmen unfortunately died. But when I watched this brought back memories from Her Majesty's Secret Service with Bond, Jules Lazenby is chasing Blofeld, Telly Savalas as well, brought back memories there. And I like this because the scene, I think I've said it before, some chase scenes can go on too long, or they're a bit repetitive. It's just like a standard car chase or something like that. Whereas this scene, they've seen different elements to it, so it kept it varied. So I quite enjoyed this.
Yeah, this was my favorite scene of the film. Kind of, the one you chose with the car chase in Melina's car was a close second, but this one just edged it for me, and I think it's because of the variety. And it did go on for quite some time, but it felt fresh along the way, and it was a really well shot scene, I thought. And towards the end of it, there's a little bit that I found quite amusing. So Eric has, he's crashed off his bike and he's got the gun out, but the gun's bent out of shape, so he throws that at Bond. That misses, doesn't do anything. So then he just picks up his motorbike and throws the motorbike at Bond. Like, who throws a motorbike? And how strong do you have to be to pick up a motorbike over your head and throw it at a human being? It was quite amusing, but I forgive it. There was not much like blatant silliness in this film. This was probably one that was a little bit too silly, but I enjoyed it. And not long after this, we see Bond in an ice hockey rink. I think he's gone to see BB, and then he's attacked by a bunch of ice hockey goons, 3 of them, I believe. And he, there's a bit of a fight scene that ensues, and he throws them along the ice as he dispatches them into the goal. And we get the sound effects and the scoreboard updating for each time it happens. So he's scored 3 goals, which again, nice little amusing touch to a scene. But it's also at this stage that we see that Luigi has been killed. We are moving on to Greece next. We open with a shot of Bond enjoying some of the local attractions with Melina.
This reminded me of on Her Majesty's Secret Service, where Bond, there's a scene, where it shows you Bond and Tracy shopping and attractions, and this reminded me a bit of that, where they're taking in the local attractions and doing a bit of shopping. So it just got brought up memories of Tracy that did, and I can't remember there's any other films as well where we've seen that Bond and the Bond girl kind of interacting outside of a like the mission, just doing normal day-to-day things. So I did like that. But we also get to see another stable part of the Bond franchise, a casino. So, Bond is in a casino, and I didn't pick up what game he was playing, Andy. I made a note which I didn't write down in the podcast notes, but I made a manual note if it was Bacharach, but I don't know if it was or not. I don't know if you have a view on that.
I don't know the game because I don't know the game well enough, but I did notice that there was a shoe involved.
Yes,
and I remember from previous episodes there was a shoe involved in a previous game of Baccarat, so that made me think that, but I could just be putting 2 and 2 together and getting 007.
So I like the bit as well because Bond is manipulating his other player basically to bet $1 million as well. So I thought that was quite funny. And also, just another little comment here: Bond drinks a glass of ouzo, if that's how you pronounce it, and then also a Greek white wine. So I think you mentioned at the top of the podcast that there was no martini, Andy. And I've just picked out a couple of drinks that he has had. So he's not gone teetotal in this film, but I'm just quickly looking now because yes, so there's no martinis, but he's had a Greek white wine and an ouzo. So he is having a little alcoholic beverage. So we also see that Columbo has a hidden microphone in the candle, and he listens to Bond's conversation with Christatus as well.
Yeah, I like that, the microphone in the candle piece. That was a nicely disguised way of doing things. Not long after this, we see Countess von Schlaff leaves with Bond. The one thing leads to another, as it tends to with Bond, and they do what Bond does with various Bond girls. And it's at this point we get nip slip number 2 of the movie. So for all of you nipple aficionados out there, here's the second point in the film where you can pause and do whatever you need to do. Not long after this, we have a little chase scene with sand buggies on the beach, and the Countess is killed when she's hit by a buggy.
Yeah, this is a little. So my note here, Andy, was why do people, when they're being chased by a van, a vehicle, a sand buggy, any kind of vehicle, why do they tend to run in a straight line? It just baffles me, is my comment.
It's interesting because you're absolutely right, logically, but I've never actually been in a situation where I've been chased by a vehicle, so I don't know how I'd react. Interesting. I don't really want to test the theory either, to be honest. But you make a sound, logical point there, but she's clearly too terrified to think logically at that point. Not long after this, we see that Bond is saved by some men emerging from the sea, and then they knock Bond out.
Yeah, and what we see now is a scene where Bond and Columbo, so obviously Chris Sartis has made out so far that Columbo is the villain, but Columbo obviously has Bond now, and they're talking on his yacht. And a comment I've made here is that the camera is rocking side from side. So I don't know, that is basically to save on the budget and they're not filming at sea. So it's kind of simulating that they're at sea. But it just was really noticeable in terms of the side from side action. But Bond and Columbo agree to work together, and we are treated to a little night covert mission. But it made me laugh, and it did with the missus as well, that it's nighttime. They're slowly creeping up on to Locke and the henchmen, but they're in a massive white yacht that belongs to Columbo. So it's not the most discreet way to kind of infiltrate an enemy base.
No, discreet is definitely not Bond's middle name here. We're getting treated to a bit of a group fight scene as well as part of this, and in a bit of a callback to previous episodes where we've commented on uniforms or attire of various villains, we have all the baddies in blue shirts and all the goodies, Bond and his crew, are all in black. So this is kind of like a home and away team kits example of that, but also it helps identify whose side is whose. Everyone's in their nice clean uniforms. We see later on Bond chasing Locke. So Locke is driving a car up a hill with the road kind of zigzags, and Bond is on foot running up steps, so he's obviously in a straight line. The car's got to travel a distance, so it doesn't, the visual isn't as preposterous as it sounds, as I've just made it sound, that a man is chasing a car on foot. We see, Locke loses control and his car's hanging on the edge of the cliff, and Bond throws the pin from Luigi in the car as if kind of one last act to say, "I know it was you that killed him," and then he kicks the car off the edge and down the cliff. The car tumbles, and I find that somewhat amusing that a man would kick a car off a cliff, because when you say that out loud, that is ridiculous. But that's what happened, and as ridiculous as it sounds, it actually kind of works in this context, because he was going to fall off the cliff anyway, I think, but just one little kick was enough to literally and figuratively send him over the edge.
It's quite a dark scene, I think, for Moore's version of Bond as well.
Yeah, it is, I agree. He possibly had chance to save him and bring him to justice in other ways, but that's not how Bond operates.
No, and I would do the same thing, Andy, if I'm honest, in that situation. Less work, isn't it? Just kicking a car over instead of taking someone in and everything and interrogating.
It is less work, yeah. Professional car kicker. That could be a new profession.
Yeah, so obviously Andy mentioned earlier about Roger Moore and BB actress Lynn Holly Johnson. So it's interesting that actually there was 30 years between Moore and the actress who played Melina, Carol Bouquet, is it? Bouquet?
Yeah, Carol Bouquet.
So, yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, that was a surprise to me, because on camera the age gap wasn't as obvious. So I had no idea that the actress who played Melina was basically the same age as the actor who played BB. Maybe that's because of the characters they portrayed as well. Melina is most definitely a woman, whereas BB is a girl. But yeah, bit surprising to find out that age gap also existed here, and especially since Bond was not resisting her advances in this case.
So this bit I found was a bit funny, where Bond tells Melina not to talk unless needed, because they're going diving for the ATEC machine. They've got to conserve air. All makes sense. And then as soon as he's down there with Melina, he makes a quip about some sharks and dining, and then he just seems to read out all the instructions for the ATECs. I don't know why he can't just do that in his head. And then he's like, well, so much for conserving any air supply there. So that did make me chuckle there. It's one of those things that I think my parents used to say, do as I say, not what I do. Also, Andy, I made a comment here. Did I hear the Jaws music in this scene in the sunken ship, or am I misremembering that? Because I did write that down, but then I'm struggling to think of. Be cool.
I don't recall, but that may be because I forgot as well. You're probably right, but I don't remember it. Anyone out there in listener land remember that? Get in touch. Let Jay know he's not going crazy after all.
And yes, yeah, hopefully I'm not going crazy. And also, we have mentioned in the past, didn't we, with Spielberg letting the, Broccoli use the Close Encounters of a Third Encounter, which is a Spielberg film. And obviously Spielberg did Jaws, so maybe there was an allowance there. But also, I made a comment here, Andy, that the baddie in the big diving gear does look like a big marshmallow man.
I agree, but one thing that came to mind when I first saw it was the film Big Hero 6, and is it Baymax? The big inflatable thing. Yeah. Kind of looked like Baymax from Big Hero 6, I thought.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, definitely.
We see Bond and sharks, and it poses the question, how many times has Bond nearly been eaten by a shark? Because it's multiple times now where he's been close to being shark bait. Shark seems to be the weapon of choice for numerous baddies. And I made a note here as well around this time, and all I wrote down was underwater robot wars, which I think is because they were in the kind of the mini submarine thing, and there were other divers that were attacking them, and they've got like their, I don't want to say ride-on subs, but the kind of smaller machinery that they were going down there and kind of chasing each other. So it just felt like underwater robot wars just covered that perfectly.
It reminded me of a bit of Thunderball.
Yes,
Did.
it did. Yes, I agree. There's in this part of the film, there's another elaborate kill attempt, and again, this is something we've mentioned in multiple films now, and earlier in this one, indeed. Why not just shoot him? Like, if you want him dead, just shoot him. That's what the most efficient way would be, surely. But no, there's more elaborate kill attempts just to prolong the film. Probably, well, not so much prolong the film, but prolong the agony and the tension, I guess it were.
I was thinking about this, Andy, before we came online, thinking that me and you were script writers for the new Bond. It probably just lasts 5 minutes. It would be so efficient in terms of either Bond would be dead or the villain would be dead. There'd be no
Shall we
around.
write the script now? Well, we'll give a rough outline. So mine would be Bond meets M. M tells him who the baddie is. Bond finds the baddie. They introduce themselves to each other. Bond shoots baddie. Bond shags baddie's girlfriend. The end.
That is, yeah. And we can fit Q in, but yeah, that is pretty much the Bond storyline.
Yeah. All done in 5 minutes, and that includes the shagging.
And that will cost you about £15 at the cinema. Just for
I'm not
going to
make any comments about £15 for 5 minutes. No, let's move on. So, last point from me before I hand over to you, and I don't put my foot in my mouth any further, is the parrot. Max the parrot is the one that tells Bond where Christatos has gone. That was a nice little touch.
Yes, but do you feel that that didn't fit in terms of the film being quite serious? Because the parrot was quite light-hearted, wasn't it? So
yes, it was. I agree. I think there was enough seriousness for it to not take away too much from the overall film, but I think they still kept in a little bit of the silliness and the cheesiness of previous films just to continue the theme. Really, you don't want to go completely 180. So I was okay with it, but you're right, it is not necessarily needed.
No, and I get your point in keeping, the Bond franchise is, there's certain elements, isn't there, that's light-hearted, some films more so than other. And then obviously, what we're just going to say now in terms of another light-hearted bit is that we see Bond and Q in disguise. So Bond goes to church and he goes into a confession booth to avoid suspicion. And Q is dressed as a vicar with a beard and Bond as a friar. I think that's technically right. I don't know if it's a friar, but that's the comment I made there. Apologies if I've got that wrong for any people that have whatever faith friars are. That's Christianity.
Let's just apologise to all vicars and friars out there. May God be with you.
And then we see Bond going free climbing to get to Christatos's hideout, which is obviously on top of I don't know if you call it a mountain or what, but it's very high up, isn't it? And it's on its own.
I'm going with mountain. I'm going with mountain because my next note includes the word mountainside, and I don't want to look like a fool in front of millions of listeners.
It reminded me a bit of Blofeld's compound on Her Majesty's Secret Service. I can't remember what the name is. That the research centre.
Yes.
On top of obviously it's not as grand as Blofeld's, but it reminded me in terms of hard to reach place to get to.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's during this climbing scene where Bond gets to the top and is caught by the henchman and is booted off the side, and he's hanging from the mountainside, as my notes so eloquently say, on his rope. So he's in midair, suspended in free fall. But his hair is immaculate, despite being in such perilous danger and the elements all around him. He still has a beautiful head of hair at this point, which is very out of place, but not from what we've seen of previous Bond films. It's actually quite appropriate that he's still got perfect hair in this situation.
Yeah, he always looks the part, doesn't he? Roger Moore's Bond. So he's probably got a load of hairspray on there. The comment, next comment is, BB gets slapped twice in quite quick succession here by two different people. So, the other note I've added in, I mentioned this, Andy, earlier, in terms of what the wife said. The BB character adds nothing to this movie and she's just totally unnecessary. You could easily take that whole storyline out, that whole character from this plot, and I don't think you would miss it. If you hadn't watched the film and I edited all her bits out, I don't think you would notice any difference in terms of the story would still flow.
I tend to agree. And maybe that doesn't help me later on when we discuss ratings for the Bond girls, potentially. I don't recall exactly where I put her in the order, but yeah, it's hard to disagree. Fine as standalone scenes, but yeah, they don't really add anything and don't enhance the story in any way. That's a very interesting point. We're getting towards the end now, and Bond and Melina are on the boat, but this time Bond doesn't need saving. It's game over. And we finish the film with Margaret Thatcher waiting to talk to Bond, and the parrot, Max the parrot, who's on the boat, telling Margaret Thatcher, "Give us a kiss, give us a kiss." There's my parrot impression for any of you Hollywood types out there, just to show my versatility. Now, I made this note, and this is maybe a little bit too political, but are we now seeing the biggest baddie of the entire franchise in Margaret Thatcher? And a couple of questions I have. Why is she making the time to speak to Bond? Like, doesn't she have mines to close or kids' milk to steal?
When I read your comment there, Andy, it did make me chuckle because it fits in the 80s, doesn't it, as well, the whole scene. And now they've got rid of Blofeld. Maybe this is it, the introduction of the new villain across the franchise.
There's your crossover. Bond versus Thatcher. It's a spy political thriller involving kids' milk and coal miners and the like.
Yeah, so my comment on your comment that you made was, does Margaret Thatcher even need to appear in this end scene? It just feels unnecessary, and it just seems like it's done purely for the audience, a bit of laughing, which again, I think it goes against the tone of the film. You could have easily finished on the end scene with Bond and Melina on the boat. I don't think this bit adds anything to the actual story.
No, I agree. And with the boat ending, that would be in keeping with previous films, as we've seen. But I also wonder whether you take Thatcher out of this scene and you replace her with Q and Tanner and M and Moneypenny, for example, and do the exact same scene, and Max the parrot tells Q or whoever to give him a kiss. Still, that would work. It doesn't need to be an actress playing Margaret Thatcher, I would say. So I agree. Totally unnecessary. Yeah. Keep Thatcher out of our films. That's what I say. There's your political stance.
Because can you imagine the next film that's released if Boris is still in office and the end scene is with a parrot and Boris, or Theresa May, or the other PMs that we've had over the years? It just didn't fit for me, because we've had the Queen, haven't we?
The Queen is one thing,
yeah,
but the Prime Minister, particularly in this case Thatcher, no, not for me.
Yes. So I've got a question for you, Andy, before we move on to our routine segments that we do. Is a bit of a closing question, really, for the film. Is, now we've watched For Your Eyes Only, and we've not watched Octopussy or A View to a Kill yet, but we've obviously made a couple of comments about Moore is starting to age. He's looking old now. Do you think, considering we've given this 7 out of 10, both of us, do you think this was a perfect opportunity to finish his part of the franchise? instead of staying on until he was 57 when he made A View to a Kill. And I know we've not rewatched those two films, Octopussy and A View to a Kill. We're going to do that over the next fortnight. So maybe you can't justify, your answer here. But do you think, because this is, I think, we're going to do the ratings of the films, but, our listeners would have known what we've done the previous one. So, this is one of two of the highest ones and more. Do you think this is a good stopping point?
In some ways, yes. From a personal opinion standpoint, this would have been leaving on a high. And you're right, we have mentioned his look and his age, but, as a standalone film, he does a great job. I think this really re-establishes him as a Bond actor as well, because I think, for me anyway, Moonraker was just not good at all. And that would have been the point to say Moore's done. And not necessarily because he was at fault for Moonraker being the film that it was, but he was already looking old. It's not a great film, so now's the time to usher in some new blood, would be my personal opinion. However, the box office stats completely go against that. So when you see that Moonraker is, to this point, the most successful Bond film of all time, of course you want to keep your main Bond actor in place for the next one. And I think in this film, he does a great job. It's a really good film. So it's hard to argue that that was the right decision. It was hard to argue that that's the wrong decision to keep him on. However, Bond is an old man now, and that's very unusual. So I would say personal preference, probably he's outstayed his welcome, but the public have spoken and paid with their money to the cinema to say otherwise.
Okay, valid comments there, Andy.
What about you, Jay? What's your thoughts?
In hindsight, because I can't remember much about Octopussy, but I do remember A View to a Kill, I think in hindsight, my personal opinion would be I'd rather an actor go out on a high than a low. So even though, we didn't think Moonraker was great, it obviously did well in the box office. I'm glad he did return for Your Eyes Only. So I'm happy with that. It's a strong entry. And I mentioned on a previous podcast that Roger Moore, his two favorite films that he did was For Your Eyes Only and The Spy Who Loved Me. So, from his point of view, they're the two that he thinks were his best films as well. So I just think, especially at the beginning, where you said about the script is kind of, they were thinking someone else was going to come in, and this is kind of a bit of not a reboot, but the change in the tone of the film. But he nails it in this film, so it's good. It's just his age. It's unfortunate, and I think I've said this before. It's unfortunate he didn't get the gig a bit earlier on, to do the number of films that he did, but just slightly earlier in his career.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Age, maybe we're being consciously or unconsciously biased here from an age perspective, but just Bond isn't an old man, but Roger Moore is at this stage, or certainly looks it. So there is a slight disconnect if you spend too much time thinking about it. Interesting to hear what anyone else out there thinks in terms of whether we're right or wrong, or whether we're just a couple of ageist pigs.
This is the 60-second review by James Bond Superfan. This week's review has been provided by Toby. Toby, you have 60 seconds. Start the clock.
Roger Moore's fifth outing as 007 sees him sent to recover a secret communications device lost at sea. Bond's only clue is a Cuban hitman who killed the British assets seeking the device. Can he find it before the Russians get their hands on it? Twists and turns see Bond having to figure out who he can trust and who can assist him in his search. A mystery villain, known only as the Dove, is out to get the device first, and Bond finds himself on the back foot. Our Bond girl is grieving daughter with a penchant for crossbows and revenge on her mind. Despite a few wobbles, she follows Triple X and Goodhead in the strong leading lady column. Action includes an interesting twist on a car chase early on, followed up with some spectacular alpine stunts, some contrasting underwater action, and finishing up with a lackluster final shootout set in a dramatic Greek mountain monastery. Moore plays the role with ease, fewer quips and gadgets than recent outings, and a much reduced budget is clearly visible. But this isn't a stripped-back gritty Bond, more sideways approach. A mediocre 6 out of 10 for the film, and 7 out of 10 for Moore's performance.
A big thank you to Toby for recording this week's 60-second review by a James Bond superfan on the Rating Room.
That's the end of the film. Good film. Let's move on to some of our, like I say, more regular segments. So let's talk some one-liners and quotes. So there's the scene we mentioned earlier with Bond and Q at the 3D identigraph, and Q is messing around with the nose, and Bond just turns to Q. A nose, not a banana, Q.
Yeah, and I mentioned this one already. So this is Bond to Melina, and Bond goes, "The Chinese have a saying, before you set out on revenge, you first dig 2 graves."
Very poignant. We have a quote from Christatos to Bond and Melina. "Bind that wound. We don't want any blood in the water. Not yet."
And a nice little ending for this feature, but Melina to Bond, and she goes, "For your eyes only, darling." So I thought that was a nice little one. So on to our next regular feature. So this is the book versus the film. And Andy, I didn't really pick out many on here, so it's quite a short segment this week. So you've obviously mentioned earlier on about the bit with the coral reefs and Bond and Melina. So in terms of the book versus the movie, the Havelocks were assassinated in Jamaica in the book, whereas obviously in the film they were killed in Greece.
Yeah, there's Countess Liesel von Schlaff doesn't actually get killed in the book. As of course we saw her get killed on the beach by the beach buggy, but not in the book.
And just finishing for this little section is Melina is called Judy in the book. So I quite prefer Melina, if I'm being honest.
Melina has a more Greek feel to it, so I guess that fits more with the film. Now, Jay, do you want to hear one of my famous Bond jokes? I use the word "my" in quotation marks.
I do want to
Okay.
hear your James Bond joke.
Okay, brace yourself for this one. What does James Bond do before he goes to bed?
I don't know. What does James Bond do before he goes to bed?
He goes undercover.
Very good. I like it. Spy related, James Bond related. It ticks all the boxes, Andy. I can't remember if we've said this before, but we're open to our listeners to send in jokes. Maybe one day we will use a listener's joke, Andy, instead of one of your original jokes.
Indeed, yes. The hours and hours I spend looking for these jokes every week for your enjoyment, listeners. But if you've got a better one, feel free to send it our way, and you may find yourself famous for a few seconds.
We obviously give you credit, but just a pat on the back.
Yeah, there's no money changing hands here. Once your joke comes to us, it's now mine, basically. I do with it as I wish.
And talking about no money changing hands, this brings us nicely onto the quiz, Andy. So our regular listeners will know about this. So let me just recap. So this part of the show is where I try to outfox Andy with 4 statements, and 2 of these statements are correct and 2 are incorrect. So from memory last week, Andy, you got the statements correct. So you got 4 out of 4.
Indeed. I even wrote in my notes and put a big box around it to highlight that I got 100% accuracy.
Nice. So you've done well. There has been the odd week where you've got either half right. I don't recall if you've got one week where you got everything wrong. I don't
Not
recall.
yet. There's a first time, but obviously for long-time listeners, they will know that you change the rules as we go along. You start as an odd one out, now it's an odd 2 out, and then you throw in these curveballs. You spent weeks and weeks building up your granddad as the biggest villain in Bond history, only for him to actually be a part of one of the questions that was truthful one week. So that was all a big ploy on your part. This is really the chance you get once a week to try and humiliate me. That's what it is. This is not for listener pleasure or for educational purposes. This is just you being cruel on air.
It's funny that you mentioned about moving the goalpost, Andy, because I nearly changed it this week to 3 statements, but are correct. Whereas before, I think it was 1 statement was incorrect and the 3 were right. I can't remember which way around it was. I can't remember.
It was 1 correct. 1 correct and 3 incorrect.
All right. So this week I nearly did 3 correct, but I resisted.
It would have been a reverse odd one out.
Yes.
An odd one in. Is that what you would call it? You can't really say the odd 3 out because it makes no sense.
I was moving the goalpost. I was just trying to make it hard because you got 100% last week, and I was being stroppy, and I was thinking about how can I trip you up this week. But I've kept it to 2. Okay. So, first statement. As always, Andy, feel free to dive in and tell me true or false straight away, or listen to all 4. So, the first statement. Roger Moore performed the majority of his climbing stunts as he was an avid climber in real life. This involved using safety ropes that can be seen in some shots of the film. The next statement. Roger Moore didn't like the scene where he killed Locke, as he didn't feel this was his version of Bond. The third statement. Roger Moore was reluctant to return after his 3-movie deal expired. The producers approached Sean Connery, who was aged 51 at that time, to return to the franchise. 2 years later, Connery made the film Never Say Never Again. And the last statement. Charles Dance turned down an audition to play James Bond after Roger Moore departed from the franchise. Would you like me to repeat any of these statements, Andy?
No, I think I've got them all wrote down, and this is another tricky one. You know, you're really trying your hardest here to fox me. I am going to say that the second statement, Moore not liking the scene where he killed Locke, I'm going to say that one's true. And I don't really know why, but something in the back of my mind tells me that I've maybe read or heard that before. Maybe when I was researching for the film. I don't recall where I've seen or heard it, but something in my mind tells me that reigns true. Now I'm going to dismiss the third statement around going back to Connery. I don't think they would have gone back a third time to Connery for some reason. I know, like you said, he did the unofficial Bond film a couple of years later, but I don't think the Bond producers were wanting to go back. I think they would have been more likely to go to Dalton earlier or another actor to try and freshen things up. So I'm going to say number 3 is false. The other 2 are tricky. I'm going to go, and this is pure guesswork now, that the more Roger Moore climbing and the safety ropes being visible, I'm going to say that's false, and I'm going to say that Charles Dance did turn down an audition, so that's true. So I'm going false, true, false, true.
Okay, Andy. So you have got 4 out of 4 correct.
He's on a roll
this week. Well done. So Roger Moore actually, he suffered vertigo during the rock climbing bit. So he didn't do his own stunts in terms of the bits where obviously was free climbing, but he did do the close up. So it was actually dangled over a 4-foot drop, whereas that was just to do all the close up shots. But he did suffer from vertigo then. And then a stuntman called Rick Sylvester did the majority of the work. But yeah, he did, a 4-foot drop. I was working that out when I was, researching this. I thought, I hate heights. I think 4 foot as well probably would get me. Whereas Sylvester, it says he was dangled over like a 20-foot drop to do those kind of scenes as well. So that is correct. Roger Moore didn't like the scene where he killed Locke because, I think, we've mentioned before, he's kind of the Bond lover as well, whereas Connery was like the Bond killer, and Moore didn't like that, because his version, even though this film was more serious, is one that he didn't really like. Sean Connery, interestingly, they didn't approach him, but Andy, I did a bit of research on this, and he was approached twice during Die Another Day and also a Daniel Craig film to come back, but they either didn't formalize it or they was rejected by Connery. And it wasn't to necessarily to come back, obviously, to replace Brosnan or Craig, but it was to feature in the Bond film in some form or another. So the Daniel Craig one, I can't remember, it was Spectre, but they basically, I think, is that the one that's done by Sam Mendes? And they basically had the idea because it was going to land on like a 50th anniversary, but then they decided that it would just take the audience too much out of the film by bringing Connery back into a Bond film.
Skyfall was 2012. That'd have been 50 years.
Yeah, Skyfall. I remember it was an S film. And Charles Dance, I thought was interesting because obviously, we mentioned earlier on that he played Ian Fleming in the GoldenEye TV movie, and then he also got offered a chance to play Bond when Roger Moore left in the 80s. But he turned down the audition, so he didn't even audition. He turned that down. So he's obviously appeared in For Your Eyes Only, and one was enough. So I thought that was interesting. He has obviously had a successful career anyway. So
yeah, he did okay for himself. But it would have fit with the theme of recycling actors for roles in the Bond franchise.
yes,
that would have been a big recycle to have a previous henchman as a new Bond.
Yeah, definitely. So on to probably one of my favorite parts of the show, if not my favorite part, and hopefully listeners like this as well. So, the listeners, you might be rewatching these, or you might not be, but you're going to have a view in terms of your own rankings and ratings. So I'm going to kick off the first three. So, our regular listeners will know that about this section, but let me kind of recap. So I'm going to go through the run times, kill count, and martini watch, and then Andy's going to pick up Bond, James Bond, Hat Watch, Felix, and box office, and then we're going to look at alternating between like Bond girls, theme song, credits, etc., etc. So Andy, you've obviously mentioned at the top of the show that the runtime 2 hours 7 minutes. So For Your Eyes Only was the seventh. For Your Eyes Only was the third longest Bond film out of the 12 films so far. And I know you've mentioned it on the last few episodes. All these Moore films seem to be consistent. You mentioned always just over the 2 hour mark, and they seem to have got the formula right now, haven't they, in terms of the length? So it's all consistent. Kill count, I mentioned at the beginning that there were 18 James Bond kills in For Your Eyes Only, which brings it in at number 4. So The Spy Who Loved Me is at number 1 on 31. You Only Live Twice is 21 kills. Thunderball is 20. And For Your Eyes Only is 18. So that moves just ahead of Moonraker on 12, which is interesting. So Roger Moore now has 70 confirmed Bond kills in his 5 films, which is only 2 fewer than Sean Connery has in 6 movies. So Roger Moore averages 14 kills per movie. So even though Roger Moore states this, Andy, in his interviews, that Sean Connery is the killer Bond and he's the lover Bond, whereas at the moment, he's averaging 2 more kills per movie than Sean Connery. And when you think about it, the Man with the Golden Gun is bottom at the moment, 12 out of 12 with 1 kill. That 1 kill is really bringing his average down. So it could have been even more.
Indeed, the numbers don't lie.
So martini watch. Andy covered this already. No martini was drunk in For Your Eyes Only. So that's a no. So Andy, over to you.
Yeah, so the introduction of James Bond, as mentioned earlier, 27 minutes and 18 seconds. It's actually the second longest time that it takes for him to introduce himself as such. There's 3 films where the introduction doesn't appear on screen, but of the ones that do, it's the second longest. Only The Spy Who Loved Me has a longer wait time for that first introduction. We do see the throwing of the hat, but not a wearing of the hat this time. So this is when Miss Moneypenny is doing her makeup in the mirror, and we see Roger Moore, James Bond, throw the hat onto the hat stand through the mirror that Moneypenny is using. Also, we've been tracking the appearances of Felix Leiter. Again, no such appearance. So this is 4 in a row now where Felix Leiter does not appear in the James Bond films. Moving on to box office. Now, this is the part that Jay really gets excited about because he loves that cash. So the budget, 27.5 million, as talked about. The worldwide box office, 195.3 million. So in terms of actual dollar amount, that would put it second on the list so far. But when you adjust for inflation based on today's prices, so using the usinflationcalculator.com website, actually puts it down in 10th place out of 12 with an adjusted box office of $617.7 million, which is around half of the top film so far, which is Thunderball, which adjusted for today's prices is over 1.2 billion. So obviously there's a bit of the economy to take into account there and the different timings and all the rest of it, but in real terms, very, very successful. In adjusted box office terms, quite low down the list. So depending on your point of view or how you want to rank them, it's a success versus a great success.
Indeed. And interestingly, Andy, I tried to keep this up to date. So when I originally did the inflation earlier on in the week, it was slightly lower than when I did it a couple of days later. So we've obviously had inflation with fins going up and up. So I thought that was interesting. It only moved by a few tens of thousands, so it didn't change much. So the methodology is sound. But I thought that was
like
quite.
Yourself, you wouldn't even notice a few $1,000, would you, here and there?
I deal with millions. It's just a rounding. But moving on. So I think this is probably one of my favorite rankings. So this is the Bond Girls rankings, and I know it's subjective, and I know we've talked about it in the past, different kind of, not metrics, Andy, it's wrong to say metrics, but it's not based purely on cosmetics, is it? It's not based purely on looks. Although saying that, Andy, I'm going to have to hand on heart to say Melina Havelock is probably one of the most beautiful Bond girls we've had. I think she's breathtakingly beautiful. I do. And I think that has influenced where I positioned her. So, I'm saying it's not based on purely on cosmetics, but I think she is one of the most beautiful Bond girls. So I'll put in at number 5. And the reason why she's not higher than that is Anya Amasova.
One for the blooper reel. just a loop of you trying to say her name.
Amasova. So the reason why she's not higher than Anya Amasova is that Anya in The Spy Who Loved Me, she was really deadly. She was basically the Russian or the KGB equivalent of James Bond. Melina she's useful. She's got a couple of kills in this movie, don't she, with her crossbow. But I think the training of Anya just pushes her, just keeps her above Melina. So That's why I put in at number 5. So originally when I did this list, Andy, I did put a one below Honey Rider in SIPs, but then I was thinking actually, Melina she's very useful in terms of doing the mission, tracking down her parents' killer as well. So she is very resourceful. So that's why I put in at number 5. Now, scrolling down, I'm scrolling all the way down in my Excel rankings table here, all the way down to number 40 and 41, Andy. So number 40, BB, and number 41, the Countess. I don't have much to say here. Obviously, I mentioned about BB. Not adding much. So she's just above the generic log cabin girl and the private jet hostess at 46. So that is where I rank her. The Countess as well. She's not in it much, is she? She's obviously has that fate argument with Columbo in the casino/restaurant. And then she has the scene with Bond back at her place on the beachfront. But apart from that, I don't think she really adds much else to the film. So that's why I put her down below. And I'm just looking above where those two are. And, I surprised myself because I put them below Rosie Carver and Ruby as well. I've made comments about those two before in previous episodes, but now I'm going to stick to that. Melina, and I think I've commented in previous episodes, Andy, where we seem to have one standout Bond girl, and then we have kind of two very much supporting Bond girls, and that's reflected in my rankings this week. What about you, Andy, in terms of where have you put Melina, BB, and the Countess?
So your last comment around one standout Bond girl and two supporting, in this case, I completely agree with. Slightly different in terms of how the ranking goes. I'm going to go in reverse order. So I've got a 38 for Countess von Schlaff. So 3 places above where you've placed her. Similar reasons, short appearances, doesn't really do much other than acts as eye candy. I know that's a very outdated term, but that's essentially what she is in this film. She does what she does with Bond, and then she gets killed. Not really much else. Now, second place of the 3, like you, I've gone with BB, but I've put her slightly higher up the list. So she comes in at 29 for me out of the 46 we've seen so far. So a little bit more generous. Your earlier argument made me think, have I gone a bit too high in terms of her usefulness? But I think I've probably been swayed by her looks a little bit here. So I've not necessarily thought with my head or my heart when placing her in at number 29. And I've mentioned this before, but one of my kind of benchmarks for a Bond girl is Tilly Masterson. I'm not really a fan of Tilly Masterson, to be honest. That's why she keeps falling and falling down the list. But in this case, BB just comes in above Tilly because I just slightly prefer it. So Tilly currently sits at 30, BB sneaks in above her at 29, but still kind of lower half of the table. So, not quite in a relegation fight, but it's not going to be challenging for the European places. And with Melina, I completely agree with your assessment. Very beautiful lady, but also I think she had a bit of independence, bit of an edge to her. I think that scene where her parents get killed in front of her, and that I mentioned her vengeful look she has in her eyes, and then she goes on something of a revenge mission and a bit of a killing spree, really helps her as a character. And for that reason, she's gone into my top 10, at 10, just below Honey Rider. So we're quite similar in our assessments of Melina versus Honey. I've got Honey on top of Melina in my list, but she gets into the top 10, so I think it's a very creditable effort, and certainly one of the stronger Bond girls we've seen in recent films.
Andy, you mentioned there about the look in Melina's eyes when her parents are gunned down. So as part of the research for the podcast, I read that originally, in terms of the script, that scene was done before the opening credits. So basically the camera then was going to zoom into her eyes, and it was going to have like a fire in, and then it was going to cut straight to the soundtrack, the title song. But I don't know who it was. It was the producers or the director wanted to open on James Bond instead. So that's why they switched it. But I was thinking about that, having, you know, where we said at the top of the podcast, you know, the Blofeld, you know, air quotes, wasn't really needed. I thought that would have been a better starting point, you know, zooming into Eventualize, like you mentioned, and having, you know, the flames, and then kind of cutting into the title song title. I thought that would have been quite nice.
I tend to agree. I think that's a really good visual that you've described there, and also it's in keeping with the theme and story of the movie, whereas the Blofeld-esque character had no bearing on the story at all. It was just kind of a standalone scene that was not necessary. So yeah, I tend to agree. That's a good assessment. Let's move on to the Bond song, For Your Eyes Only by Sheena Easton. I thought it's a really good song. It's in the mix for one of the better songs ever, and I was really struggling to place this one, and I've been listening to the podcast. Sorry, I've been listening to the Spotify playlist again recently just to make sure that I'm correct in my thinking, and I think I am. So I've gone with 5th out of 12 so far, so just below Diamonds Are Forever by Shirley Bassey and just above You Only Live Twice by Nancy Sinatra. It could easily have gone it could have gone higher than 5th, but I think there's just enough in those other songs by Shirley Bassey and by Carly Simon in the 3rd and 4th place for me, just to give it a slight edge, but a very, very good Bond song for me.
Yeah, it is a classic, isn't it? And I like the kind of the slower tempo kind of ballad type of Bond song. And I've ranked it in at number 3. So for me at the moment, Shirley Bassey's Diamonds Are Forever and Goldfinger are my 1 and 2. And when I was ranking these, I did start from the bottom with this one, and I thought straight away just moving up. And then I got to the point of around 3 and 4, and I'm thinking, no, I do like it better than Live and Let Die. And then I was thinking, oh, do I move it above Goldfinger? And then, like you, I was listening to the Spotify playlist, and I'm thinking, no, I think it's a solid number 3 for me. For me, it is better than McCartney and the Wings, but it wasn't as good as the 2 classics of, you know, like I said, Goldfinger and Diamonds Are Forever. So I was happy it was in at number 3. It is a classic song, and it is a song that I have listened numerous times this week in preparation of the podcast and thinking about where it ranks. So moving on, we're on to the opening credits. And, you know, me and Andy have said this each week now. They're quite samey, and it's for me, it's definitely getting hard to place these films because, like we said, they're a bit samey. You got silhouettes, naked women, but for me, and this is the same with Moonraker and also The Spy Who Loved Me, Roger Moore is getting in on the action now with the opening credits. So I am tending to score these a bit higher. So I've got this one in at number 5. And again, for me, it's in at number 5. I nearly put it in at number 4, Andy, if I'm being honest, because Sheena Easton, I like that the singer is the only one to date to appear in the title song. So I did like that. But then I think The Spy Who Loved Me just edged it. So it was very close between 4th and 5th, but I put it in at number 5. So out of the 12, it's just above mid-table at the moment at number 5. What about you, Andy?
So for me, I slightly preferred it to what we've seen in recent weeks. I was saying, particularly last week, they're kind of getting a bit lazy. And there's not really a great deal of change in this. I think Sheena Easter featuring is a nice touch. And maybe the song helps in some regards. But for me, again, it could have gone most places in the list. It's a bit, you know, nothing original now. It's all much of a muchness, but I slightly preferred it to Diamonds Are Forever. So for that reason, I put it in at number 8. So next up, we have the Bond villains. Now, we mentioned earlier the 3 villains in place for this were Eric Kriegler, we have Christatos, and we have someone else. We have Emil Locke. Apologies, my memory slips there. I've got to admit, so I'm just looking at my listings now. So we've got 32 villains listed now for the franchise so far. And as much as I enjoyed the film, I have to say on the whole, all 3 of those villains were quite weak and standalone characters. So they've all featured quite low on my list. So going in reverse order, I've got Emil Locke at 26, kind of the 3rd best of the 3 this film, just above Chang from Moonraker and just below Blofeld from Thunderball. A bit of a nondescript character for me. Now, there's the villainous part was more about him, like the things he supposedly did or the things were being said about him, not necessarily the menacing nature of him, because I don't think he was a menacing character at all. So it's quite weak, really, as a character. So 26 out of 32 is where I've got him pitched. And then Kriegler and Christatos I've got in at 20 and 21 respectively. Kriegler, from a henchman perspective, was okay, but again, neither character, just as characters, really did it for me. And I think the film getting as high a mark as we gave it was more to do with the story and the performances of Roger Moore and, you know, just the general vibe of the film as opposed to the villains. I think the villains were quite weak. I think with stronger villains, this could have been an all-time great Bond film and maybe even gone top of the pile. But the villains kind of let things down for me. So I've got Eric at 20, Christatos at 21, and Locke at 26. How does your rating compare, Jay?
I actually agree. Well, my rankings are different slightly, Andy, but everything you've just said there, I agree. Because when I were putting these in the 32 table at the moment, and where they dropped in, I'm thinking to myself, like what you just said, if they were higher, or even if there was at least one higher, then that might have tipped the 7 out of 10 to be an 8 or a 9. They're just more wasn't against any strong villains. And so I've put in a slightly different order. So I've got Eric Kriegler in at 27. He was intimidating in terms of physically, in terms of, you know, throwing a rifle, snapping a rifle and throwing a motorbike. But, you know, you picked up on his lack of ski skills, you know, in terms of chasing Bond. He might have been a bit intimidating, but he's nowhere near. This is how bad I've rated him. He's below Nick Nack on my list. And, you know, I've commented about Nick Nack in previous episodes in terms of I didn't rate him at all. And he's only one above Mr. Osata in You Only Live Twice. So he can't have been that intimidating. But physically, I think the only thing for him was that he was supposed to be a bit of a Eastern European, I don't know if he's ex-Nazi, but German, isn't he? Kind of villain, henchman. So that's why I put him there. And interestingly, I put him lower than Locke because I think Locke, that actor, and I don't know any other work that he's done, he could play a good serial killer. He could. I think he has that look. So in terms of kind of going against Bond, I think he's quite a good villain in terms of not scary, because he's not like it. And I'm just looking at the other people that, you know, on our list, and he's not intimidating, but that actor could play a good serial killer. But it's just weak. So I put Locke in at 25, which is one below Sander by The Spy Who Loved Me, where Bond obviously, you know, dropped him off the, you know, knocked him off the edge of the building. So again, that's a weak entry. And then Christatos, 21. He's a megalomaniac, but he's only about wealth. He doesn't have a big plan like people like Goldfinger or even Stromberg, you know, or Drax, you know, in terms of Moonraker. I put even Drax higher than that. Christata. So it was just a week across the board. So I totally agree with what you said there, Andy, and you articulated it better than me. It's just, I think usually there's one villain that kind of stands out, and then you might have kind of two supporting villains, similar to Bond girls. Whereas here, you put them in at 20, 21, and 26, and I've done 21, 25, and 27. So across the board, it's quite weak.
Yeah, it kind of feels like it wasn't Bond against a villain. It was more Bond on a mission, and there were villains in the way.
Yeah.
Like when you think about the Connery films, and he generally is up against Spectre. And, there are obviously storyline points throughout the film, but arguably the main focus is Bond versus Blofeld, or Bond versus Spectre. Although that's not the story, that is more of a focal point. Whereas this, for me, the focal point was the mission rather than the villains. So maybe that's what makes them either less noticeable or less prevalent, which makes them lower on our list.
No, that's a good point. I'm just looking at, in terms of previous film, Moonraker, he's obviously going against Drax, who, is, there's a missing spaceship, isn't there? He's all in space in terms of the space city. Scaramanga, he's, like a number one assassin, hitman. Even Stromberg, who's, tried to pull together his kind of underwater city, his plans. Kananga is all about flooding the drug market in America. So yeah, you're right. This is and the Bond is kind of stopping those, whereas this definitely feels he's basically just finding not a lost ship, but a lost device on a ship, isn't he?
Yeah, exactly that.
So moving on, we're on to the movies now. So me and Andy's obviously said, what we've given it. So this is the ranking now. So as we've said on previous episodes, we're not having any tied positions. So I've given For Your Eyes Only 7 out of 10, which is the same score that I've given The Spy Who Loved Me, Thunderball, and Dr. No. So as we've said before, we've got to give it one position. So I've put it in at number 5. So I do think this is his second best Bond film in terms of Roger Moore. The Spy Who Loved Me just sneaks it, but it's a solid entry, Andy. Number 5 out of 12. It's a good entry, and like you said, if there was better villains, maybe it would have been slightly higher up. But at the moment, I've gone in at number 5, 7 out of 10, the second best Roger Moore film so far. What about you?
So I agree with it's the second best Roger Moore film. However, my favourite Moore film so far has been Live and Let Die. And I also ranked it 7 out of 10. And of the 7 out of 10 films, I've put it top of that pile. So for that reason, it comes in at number 3 overall. Got Goldfinger on 9, Live and Let Die on 8, and then For Your Eyes Only. I thought this was a really strong effort, a real return to form, like I said. And I slightly preferred it to On Her Majesty's Secret Service, which was a really good film with George Lazenby. This was just a really strong film by Roger Moore, and if this was a debut, it would have been raved about as one of the great Bond debuts. Certainly much higher than Dr. No was. So I'm pleased that it went back as high as it did, and that I enjoyed it as much as I did, because after Moonraker, my expectations were low, but this really pulled it out of the bag for me. So top 3. So moving on from that, how does it rank by actor? And I think we've touched on that a little bit already. So from my perspective, this is the second best Roger Moore film behind Live and Let Die. So of the 5 Roger Moore movies we've seen so far, total score is 30 out of 50, average 6 out of 10 for me. What about you, Jay? If you want to just expand on your ranking?
Yeah, so as we've pretty much covered in terms of where I think it sits in terms of Roger Moore, which is very interesting, Andy, seeing your scores against mine, because I'll pull it in at number 2, 7 out of 10 for Roger Moore, just behind The Spy Who Loved Me. But interestingly, Andy, I've got exactly the same as you in terms of 30 out of 50, giving an average of 6 out of 10 for Roger Moore, even though we have scored. Let me have a look. So Spiral of Me, I've gave 7. You've given 7. For Your Eyes Only, we've both given 7. Live and Let Die, I've given 6. You've given 8. Moonraker, 5 to your 3. The Man in the Golden Gun, 5 each. So it's Live and Let Die and the Moonraker is the ones that are different, but are kind of equaling out in terms of the average. So I felt that was quite interesting.
Yeah, my love for Live and Let Die is stronger, but my hate for Moonraker is also stronger. So we've met in the middle.
Yes. And finishing off in terms of the rankings, there's not much change really in terms of, well, there's no change actually. Roger Moore is still my second favourite actor. The For Your Eyes Only doesn't change that. Sean Connery is number 1, Roger Moore's number 2, and George Lazenby is number 3. Over to you, Andy. Does this change anything for you?
It doesn't, but I think I touched on it last week that if Moore was to produce poor performances, there was a chance he could drop down the order. He pulled it out of the bag this time, so he's solidified his silver medal status as things stand. So the order remains the same. And that is this for another week. So before I say goodbye, let's just recap, because next up is film number 13 of the franchise out of 25. So it's the halfway point. So it's a good time to just do a quick recap of what Bond's been up to so far. So we've seen him fight Dr. No. We've seen him go against Blofeld and Spectre. We've seen him against a man who covers bodies in gold paint. And we've seen him in space. But next week, on the next Bond film, we see him fight 8 cats. Because next week, we're going to be discussing Octopussy.
A battle for humanity's future is being waged on American soil right now. The cannabis plant has been used by humans for thousands of years, and yet it is still severely criminalized in much of the world. But the world is changing. Yay! In the U.S., 37 states have legalized cannabis for medical purposes, and 18 have done so for recreational use by adults. In Illinois, legalized cannabis has spurred an explosion of new businesses and products, all bringing in a massive stream of newly created revenue that other states are eager to match. Yet federally, cannabis faces much of the same resistance of the 1900s. How did marijuana get such a bad reputation? Why is it still so federally restricted? How are smoking and vaping different? How many edibles are too many? Which companies are coming out with the best new products? And who benefits from keeping Mary Jane in the dark? These are the types of questions we'll attempt to answer on the Cannabis Man podcast. A thorough look at all things cannabis, from its history to its explosion in states that have legalized it. So look out for the Cannabis Man podcast, coming soon wherever you get your podcasts.
Well, that's this week's episode done. We hope you enjoyed it.
Special thanks to the band Sugar Tongue for the theme tune to The Rating Room. You can find them on all the usual social media channels, and be sure to check out their song The System, available now on Spotify.
You can find and message us on Twitter, Facebook, TikTok and Instagram by searching The Rating Room.
You'll find all our social media links on our website, theratingroom.com, and subscribe to our YouTube channel, or feel free to drop us an email at theratingroom@gmail.com. Goodbye, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week, right here on The Rating Room.